welcome to the 21st episode of Information Revolution, a podcast about information. And we've basically hit 1 year, so that's pretty exciting. We'll do the usual introductions and then we'll get into the topic for our 21st episode. So my name is Michael Upton and I am an information management consultant and one of the directors of a little company called Metataxis, New Zealand.
And I'm Judi Vernau, and I'm an information architect, and I'm also a director of Metataxis.
And I'm Karl Melrose. I work for Castlepoint Systems. My views, however, are my own.
I was thinking that it probably makes sense that given it's 21 episodes in, and it's probably going to be about exactly a year since we first released episode number 1, that we do a little bit of a kind of retrospective, as it were. Not like a greatest hits episode. Do you remember Happy Days when they just cobbled together random clips? Not that. We're going to just talk about some reflections from how it's been for us recording this. And I would say personally that I tend to try and say things as sort of stridently and confidently as I can in terms of what I'm thinking at any given time. But sometimes I do think, even midstream or by the end of the episode, oh yeah, now I see things a different way. So, Judi, I think you had some thoughts to kick us off.
And yeah, I think I would agree with you that by the end of some of the episodes, at least, I've thought, I hadn't thought about it quite like that. So I'm really hoping that some people out there who are listening to that have felt the same. But anyway, let's move on. I think the main thing that struck me is really thinking hard about what would help the organisation. I mean, I know that's what we're here for, whether you're information management or information architecture. We are trying to do things that benefit the organisation. Otherwise, what the hell are we doing? But I hadn't seen it quite as clearly as in a couple of the sessions that we had. One from the point of view of engaging with management and trying to get from them what they think should be happening. What do they want people to do? And the other way was the users, which I hope I would be engaging with around what would help you. But I think I hadn't seen it quite as clearly in the way some of our discussions put it and some of our people who joined us put it, in terms of in an information management team, which is not necessarily my area so much, but actually going out there and saying, how can I help you, rather than being a reactive information management team. I thought that was really cool. And I think when Amy was talking a week or two ago about engaging with users and the different ways that you can do that, and I hope that I've done a lot of that in my work, but she was emphasizing more about how she said, not just finding out what they're doing, but how they're feeling about it and what their motivations are. And I hope that I would do that, but I don't think I'd seen it quite as clearly as the way she put it. I think when I'm engaging with a team around what kind of an information architecture will help, I would obviously talk about what are your current pain points. But it was just something about the quality of how she was talking about it that made me, and she did kind of emphasize how people feel about it. Well, you quite often find that anyway, because they're so delighted to tell you how, won't use that word, how unhelpful they find systems sometimes. But I guess you feel like you're doing these things anyway, but sometimes you don't see it as clearly. You don't stand back and really analyze why you're asking certain questions and what you really need to know. What do you think?
Yeah, fantastic. So just to make it super clear for the listeners, in case you're tuning in or missed that episode, Judy's referring to Amy Stock's the human-centered design episode. Yeah, and I had the same experience when she was talking about that idea of feelings or perhaps sentiment. I can't remember the exact words. That yeah, that's not the kind of discovery I normally think about, or the kind of scope of discovery. And it totally made sense to me. I think we kept emphasizing it in that episode that what she said seemed like real common sense, but there was something about the clarity with which she described it that
That's it,
really,
clarity, yeah.
yeah, really kind of struck home. And I think, like reflecting really generally on doing these podcasts, both in terms of trying to articulate what I'm thinking, but also listening to the two of you and listening to our guests, I find that that kind of idea of basically being able to sort of form up and clarify in a better way what I'm thinking, or how I like what I think matters in the work that we do. That's a really kind of recurrent theme for me. I feel like it's been really beneficial for me, even if we never released any of these and no one else ever listened to any of them. Just this process of actually saying some stuff out loud and trying to nail it as well as I can on the spot, to let people kind of behind the curtain. We deliberately try and keep this pretty conversational. So although we'll agree a topic and I might sort of have it some time to figure out what I'm about to say, the exact words, as I'm sure you can hear, are not things that we've planned in advance. So yeah,
But
so
that
I
was,
think
I mean, that was always the point. And I know
mm,
we I think this is actually the second chop at this. We had um, another sort of go originally, but the briefs before we were talking about this were just always, we have these great long conversations when we get on together, and it'd be great if we could have these in a public forum, because other people might be interested. It's interesting, but the masters that I'm doing at the moment, one of the things that they do is they place a huge emphasis on reflective spaces where you can just essentially talk with other people and reflect on what's been going on publicly, so that you can get other people reflecting on that thing that you're reflecting on as well. What's in them when you talk about it. That to me has always been the value of this. It's being able to talk about failure of EDRMS, and all the stuff that all these things that are going on in our industry at the moment, with two people who are tied to them in completely different ways. I mean, Judi, what you just said about um, the slight difference that you have in perspective because you're an information architect, that's been a huge, huge source of a new perspective for me. I got a friend who's a consultant who always talks about this, as well as the 2D, 3D perspective. And it's kind of, you've only ever got your 2D perspective, but you know what? There could be a third dimension to this as well, but you've actually got to see it differently. You actually have to ask people, and that's been so much of the value of this for me.
yeah, I think on that reflection, I guess one of the things I'm really seeing is that I mean, we kind of almost jokingly call this the information revolution, like with this idea that there needs to be one, there needs to be some kind of a revolution in our ways of working, or our practices. But it's really really landed, I suppose, in my mind through our conversations, how bringing in other perspectives and rethinking things and challenging tradition, is critical. And I think, I mean, part of it is that this is an opportunity for reflection, and I guess it has been really beneficial. And it does, I mean, it's funny, kind of at a meta level, doing this podcast is in itself creating a reflective space for us. I guess that's what you're saying, Karl. Um, and that now we're reflecting on the reflective space.
I guess it's a
Yeah.
problem too, isn't it? Because you can't remember what it was like to think differently. You just think differently, and that for me is something. Apart from the fact that I have a 3-month-old child at the moment, so I don't sleep and my brain doesn't work anyway. But I know there have been real moments for me in lots of these episodes we've had where I've got just a slight difference in emphasis or a slight difference in articulations made me change the way I think about something. But the overwhelming thing for me too has been, there are no we're not talking about easy problems. Going back through our topic list, I mean, maybe what to do with your information stock take, which was episode 3, was maybe that was a relatively uncomplicated thing to talk about. But, everything else, skills for the future and virtuous cycles and failure of EDRMS and the Microsoft 365 episode, I mean, I'm still, the failure of EDRMS episode for me was deeply uncomfortable to start with, even though I think it's really, really, necessary to talk about it. And, NIA came out, the Australian National Auditor's Office came out last year, a couple of weeks ago, saying that 93% of content in the agencies that they audited was now sentenced. So, I mean, I think if we can look at, say, EDRMS is the one place where that, and I know I've missed that statistic. I haven't quoted it correctly, but it's definitely 93% is unsentenced. I just can't remember the context because, again, baby brain. But I mean, that if EDRMS has been the one system that complies, I mean, saying that 93% of the content must not be in it because it isn't sentenced is massive. And so we need to break those things. But even looking at that episode, I'm still deeply uncomfortable because I still feel like EDRMS actually has a really important place to play in the future of records management. And I don't think throwing it out makes sense. And I'm not sure that, that necessarily came across in that episode. And I hope that people don't take things away from that episode like we should just throw this out. And the next episode where we got into Microsoft 365, which I'm a bit of a fan of, I hope people didn't take, my fandom of that as we've got to throw out the EDRMS and move to Microsoft 365, because nothing is that simple. And that's the thing that just keeps coming out for me. We are dealing with all these really complicated problems. And I think one of the other things that's emerging for me as well is that we're dealing with them without a research base. That's something that I'm finding that I've found very strange in records management for a while. I went looking for the origins of a bunch of different practices a while ago and just couldn't find them, like functional classification, for instance. Why do we do functional classification? Well, it's because essentially a couple of very high-profile people, very high-profile archivists had a shouting match in the 1940s and one of them won, and that happened to be the person who was advocating for functional classification. The other person happened to be advocating for subject-based classification. And so what I keep coming back to is, how do we find a research basis for some of these things that we're doing to say, here is the best way to do it. Here is the practice that makes sense now. And I feel like we've nudged towards some of those things, but I still feel like we're articulating a set of problems. It's almost like we're trying to raise problems to a level of awareness. I don't know whether we're solving them. I don't know whether we can solve them. But
I'm sure there is a lot of research, a lot of people out there doing their masters or whatever on the success or otherwise of functional classification. It's just maybe they're just published somewhere and we don't take any notice of them. But I'm sure that I've been present at presentations around this in my time. I'm sure there's quite enough around that. I just wanted to pick up what you said about EDRMS, and I mean, we covered some of this in the session, I think, but we're thinking about that as a monumental system, like the ones that we could mention. But actually what we should be thinking about is the system side of it, as in system processes. So not EDRMS, yes, that's this huge thing that you buy and you put it there and now you've got the tick and it's done. It should be much more around the system side of it, meaning the way things work in order to get the results that you need. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it
Yeah,
does.
totally. And I think maybe I touched on the idea of sort of, for instance, like one of the classic things that people talk about with an EDRMS is around sort of, or one of the kind of use cases or scenarios is around managing um, information requests. So, you're going to have different words for that in different jurisdictions, but basically, requests for information that need to go through a formalized process. And that's the kind of thing that could be technically its own tool or its own set of tools. And it could form part of what, as a business concept, you think of as part of your EDRMS. But I think we've always conflated one tool set, one piece of software with an EDRMS and said that that thing
Yeah,
has to be the
exactly.
be all and end all. And I think,
Yeah.
uh, you know, in order to achieve compliance, for instance, but actually, if we have many sets of tools or, sort of a platform and we can apply the right controls to any of those tools, then yeah, we could have lots. And there could be other reasons why that's bad, but it could deliver better results than having one. On this kind of reflection tip that, yeah, I think I always try and sort of get across whatever I think is the main point that I hope people would think about listening to this. And sometimes I feel like the nuance falls by the wayside because I'm trying to get across the main thing. And I might have it in my head, of course there's going to be exceptions, or of course this won't be true all the time. But it feels like that's kind of making things murky or too fuzzy to sort of often bring that into the picture. And so I think, for example, one of the episodes I remember we talked about working with the exec, and we were sort of saying, oh, well, actually,
Mm.
heaps of the time you don't want to actually engage with the exec at all. Like, are you sure? Are you clear on when it is that you ought to take your sort of business problem or your requirements to the exec or whatever it is? And that is the kind of thing where actually in real life, I've had really fruitful conversations with executives sometimes, but it's just, I mean, I can't remember either, but I imagine in that episode that I didn't bother to say that because I would have been emphasizing the main thing I wanted to get across. And I think maybe
Mm.
that's the nature of how these things work, is that it's all going to be too much of a kind of drifty, sort of equivocal, sometimes this, sometimes that kind of a conversation if we don't just sort of almost pick a side and sort of advocate. It's almost a sort of a old school debating kind of thing where that's sometimes how I feel when I'm getting on
Maybe
a
that's
rant.
what we need to. Maybe that's what we need to do, though. We need to say now, here is so and so for the positive side of this
Oh,
thing,
yes,
and
okay,
here's
and
so
then
and so
argue
for the
against it.
yeah. Establish and sides and draw battle lines and
On that, years ago, chuck in something new but related. That yeah, years ago I worked for a guy who basically try that in meetings. He would say, okay, in this meeting, who's going to be the devil's advocate? And at the start of every team meeting, we would he would let someone be the devil's advocate, and he would basically say, your job is to shoot everything down that we say. Let's go. And by giving someone that permission to basically cut into the kind of the idea is to basically try and undercut groupthink, where you all get together and someone
yeah.
charismatic says some stuff in the room and everyone goes, yeah, that sounds right, without without necessarily thinking it through. Um, yeah, it's basically like, well, if you give someone that official job and you say basically you're only doing your job if you're being negative and rude, maybe not rude, but you know what I mean.
You give
Then
them a role to play.
that's
I
right.
love
Give
it.
someone a
Yeah.
role and go, let's go. And I wonder about that in terms of a lot of the sort of nature of doing consulting work is you're often sitting in a sort of change conversation, in a project where someone's trying to get something to change. And I often wonder about that. I often think, what if we just assign people
Yeah.
roles to give things a shove? Yeah. And say, well, it's just
I
you
th-
doing your
And
yeah,
job.
I think that's
and
a
none of us have ever been in a position, have we, where we've been brought in to do something and then been sitting there thinking, I'm not sure this is such a good idea.
oh, never happened to me. Never happened.
Yeah, never ever.
No, never ever, never ever.
I think the idea of that kind of debate is really, really cool. Actually, deliberately putting the negative side as well as the positive, or whatever it is however it is you're arguing
Yeah.
about it. I once organised a debate with my professional society, the International Society for Knowledge Organisation. I organised a debate on this house believes that the thesaurus is dead. So a very kind of niche subject, but honestly, it packed the place out.
Uh,
And the debate was published, and follow on was published in our professional journal, Knowledge Organisation, as well, because it really captured people and they were up for debating even this little recondite kind of topic down here. So, we should organise a debate. EDRMS is dead, or functional file plans are dead, or, something like that, and do a pro and con. I think we'd get a lot of listeners, actually.
You go,
with the
information
records
revolution
team.
events.
Yeah,
Oh.
yeah.
No, but I mean,
T-shirts.
you remember I ran that event, the future of EDRMS, a couple of years ago, and I got was it 2 or 3? I got 2 EDRMS vendors on, and then I got somebody on representing Microsoft 365, and I got 2 of the, sort of non-EDRMS, future of EDRMS type vendors on, and just got them all to have a conversation about it. And we had about 350 people sign up for that. It
Awesome.
was,
Yeah, I imagine.
it was. I mean, maybe that's what we should do next. Live public debate, tarring and feathering of someone's idea. There is lots of good stuff you can do with meetings, though, too. Actually, and projects, and what you were just talking about reminded me of something that there's a guy named Gary Klein came up with, which was a pre-mortem. And the pre-mortem is something that you do at the start of a project where you sit down and say, what are the, if we get 12 months down the track and this has failed, how is it going to have failed? What are the things that are going to have been most critical in its failure? I had somebody remind me of that recently and get me to do it for a piece of work we were doing together. And it
Yeah,
was
that's.
very, very good.
I mean, I introduced that with one of my clients just in the last week, and it's definitely from you, Karl. Whether it was from this podcast previously or whether it was from
We
your
sure
blog.
talked about it, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I was also thinking. I mean, one thing that might be interesting to say out loud here is that a real challenge I've found with the public sector is that we've talked about the power of telling stories, and we're sort of saying here about representing different sides and things. Sometimes it is really hard to have people tell either really positive stories or their war stories, things that have gone horribly wrong
Yeah.
publicly. Like there's a real sort of reticence to, sort of expose the workings of the public sector to a sort of potentially negative publicity, I suppose. Like there's kind of this thing that if I were to have a negative stereotype about sort of presentations at conferences, it's often sort of someone in a kind of management role basically saying how great whatever they just managed to complete was. And that's all good, and I am being deliberately negative there, just to emphasise, to be equivocal. But it's really hard to get people to stand up and say, "Oh, we're absolutely struggling at the moment, and these are the things I'm seeing." And sometimes that's because it's also potentially sort of personal, as in, you might be basically sort of um, I'll avoid using a rude phrase there. You might be saying bad things about people who you are working with, and that could be within
Yeah,
your
that can be
team,
really
sort of in the
difficult.
sense of within your organisation, or a sort of a vendor or a partner, delivery partner, um, and that's hard. But if we could get more of that out in public, I think that would be so valuable. Like it'd be such a good thing, to sort of routinely share the horror stories. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we're always asked for examples of organisations who are doing this well, whatever this is. at any given moment. And I always struggle to be able to actually point to people who I think are doing things well. I mean,
Right. Yeah.
Amy said, "I've never seen perfect." Well, that's right up there. But just seeing people do things reasonably well, or am I being too negative?
There's a bunch of organisations that I feel really positively about locally, and they're definitely not doing everything well. So I guess you have to be clear on what a reasonable bar is, and perhaps my
Yeah,
bar is
that's very
lowered over
true.
the years, frankly, and and
Yes.
and so I'm always coming back to that thing, and I'm sure I've done it a million times in this podcast of sort of like, where's the greatest value, where's the payoff, the value in the work as well as in the information. So it could be about playing down risk rather than about increasing the value of something or protecting the value of something. But I find that organisations that take that on, and they will have sunk some good work into those bits that matter the most. And then if you look in the wrong direction at some other part of the organisation, you'll see it's kind of a bit loose and a bit feral, and that could be really disheartening. But I think if you stand back enough, you can kind of see, oh, okay, the things that matter are working well. But I think it can be very hard when you're actually responsible, to think, oh yeah, this is good enough, or I'm doing pretty well here.
You're too close.
Too close.
I mean,
Yeah.
I really do
Narrow
think we have
framing.
I think we really do have an isolated pockets of excellence thing going on in our industry.
Mhm.
But
Sure.
I think that problem, Michael, is related to what you just described as well, which is that people are so reluctant to talk about what's going on in their organisation, and particularly to talk about it critically. And you're aware that I'm running an executive engagement stream for Rimper at the moment, and I think half the value of what we're actually doing is we're actually just providing a reflective space where everybody is there for the same reason. And so, we put people into small breakout rooms, that we make use of small breakout rooms a lot. And I think that just putting people into a space where they can reflect on what's been going on with their own executive, how they've been dealing with it, what's slowing them down, so that they can get some help from other people, in a confidential environment, where they can really talk about the problem in depth. I mean, I think that's actually a large, we're going to get to the end, and I'm going to try and separate the value of just getting people together to talk to other practitioners in a confidential environment and the value of the course material that I've actually put together. And, I'm not sure which one's going to come out as being the more valuable.
I definitely feel that when I'm running training courses, is that often just actually connecting a bunch of people who, the attendees or whatever, the delegates, sometimes I think, oh man, that's been the big plus for the people. It's the value, not the course material. Or hopefully both, of course, but
I hope so, because, there's been a
Yeah,
lot,
quite.
I've put a lot of time into the course material.
yeah. Okay, so I think that's probably us for this episode. So thanks very much, everyone, for listening in. And if you do have thoughts, we've been pondering out loud about, obviously what we've done so far, but also where we might go with this. Then let us know. Could we try and organise a formal debate via podcast? Who can say? Anyway, thanks very much, and we will catch you again shortly.